Pregnant and homeless, widow was sold for $1. You're mine forever, giant Viking said. The village, once alive with laughter and the chatter of market traders, now lay in silent decay. Wooden shutters hung crooked on their hinges, and the snow-covered paths were littered with forgotten debris. In the midst of this silence, a lone figure moved with cautious determination. Ilara's hands were pressed tightly against her thin cloak as she walked. Her body ached from hunger, and every step through the snow felt like climbing a mountain. She was alone. She had been alone for what felt like an eternity, carrying a grief heavier than any winter storm. Her husband had been taken by a fever the year before, and now, with a child growing inside her, the world seemed colder than ever. The villagers avoided her gaze, as if her presence reminded them of the tragedies they preferred to forget. Ilara kept her head down, her brown hair falling like a curtain around her face, hiding the sharp green eyes that still held a spark of defiance. She did not beg, though she often wished for a warm meal or a roof over her head. Pride, stubborn and unyielding, anchored her to the fragments of her dignity. But pride could not buy food. Pride could not stop the gnawing hunger in her belly. Pride could not shield her from the merciless frost. One evening, as twilight painted the sky with shades of crimson and violet, a figure approached from the town square. He was a man like none she had ever seen, tall, broad, and impossibly strong, with hair the color of burnished gold and eyes that seemed to pierce through the cold itself. Word had traveled like wildfire in Eldenport of Rurik the Giant, a warrior whose name alone sent shivers down spines. Legends spoke of his strength, his battles with dark creatures, and a curse that left him untouchable and feared. Ilara froze, instinctively clutching her cloak tighter around her body. The man's gaze fell upon her, steady and unyielding, and a strange shiver ran through her, not from fear alone but from the intensity of his presence. "You," he said, his voice deep, resonant, and commanding. "You are alone." Ilara did not answer. Words were dangerous. They could betray her weakness. She only shook her head slightly, her eyes wary. Rurik took a step closer. "The world has no mercy for those who wander without protection," he said. "And yet you walk through it as if it owes you nothing." "I owe it nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I only want to survive." Rurik's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. There was no warmth in it, but it held a promise that made her pulse quicken. "Survival has a price," he said, "and tonight I am willing to pay it." Before Ilara could understand what he meant, two of his towering men stepped forward, their presence like shadows stretching across the frozen ground. She realized with a sudden sinking feeling that she had no choice. The villagers who watched from windows and alleys whispered amongst themselves, but none dared intervene. Her heart pounded as she was led toward a massive black steed. Its coat shimmered under the dying light, almost as if it had absorbed the shadows of the mountains themselves. Rurik mounted effortlessly, his gaze never leaving hers. "You will come with me," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You will have warmth, you will have food, and if you survive my company you will have protection." Ilara's mind raced. Protection from him. Protection from what? The question died on her lips. She had no strength to resist, no one to defend her, and the cold gnawed at her bones like a living thing. Reluctantly, she allowed herself to be guided to the horse. The journey began in silence. Snow fell thick and heavy, covering the ground like a white shroud. Trees, gnarled and ancient, loomed on either side of the narrow path, their twisted branches scratching at the sky. Ilara wrapped her cloak tighter around her shoulders, trying to shield herself from both the cold and the unsettling presence of the giant warrior beside her. Rurik spoke only once during the long ride, his voice a low rumble. "You are not like the others," he said. "They would have begged, cried, or run. You endure." Ilara looked away, unsure if she should answer. The truth was simple. She endured because she had no choice. Her life had been stolen, her home had rejected her, and now the world offered her nothing but hardship. Hours passed, and the shadows grew long. The path led them to a bridge spanning a frozen river, where the wind howled with a voice that seemed almost human. Alara's stomach churned with unease. There was something about the wilderness here, something ancient and alive, that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Rurik stopped atop the bridge and dismounted, his towering frame even more imposing on the frozen wooden planks. "From here the journey is dangerous," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Dark things linger in these lands, spirits, curses, creatures of old." Alara's pulse quickened. "Why take me into danger?" she asked. "Because," Rurik said, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful, "you are not ordinary. And neither am I for a moment." The wind ceased its wailing, and Alara dared to look at him. There was something in his eyes, a storm of loneliness and fury that mirrored the chaos within her own heart. She wanted to turn away, to flee, yet something rooted her to the spot, a curious, inexplicable trust, fragile and untested. Night fell as they continued their journey, and the moon rose like a pale guardian over the mountains. They came to a clearing where the ruins of an old temple lay buried in snow. Its walls were broken, its towers collapsed, yet there was a strange majesty in its decay. "This is where we rest," Rurik said. He helped her from the horse, and for the first time she noticed the gentleness in his movements, a stark contrast to the legends of brutality she had heard. By the flickering fire he built, Alara felt warmth seep into her frozen limbs. She watched him, unsure whether to fear him or feel grateful. The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles and the weight of battles fought long before she was born. "You will sleep," he said, "but do not mistake rest for safety. Even here, the night is alive with eyes that watch and teeth that wait." Alara nodded, too tired to speak. The fire crackled between them, a fragile barrier against the dark that stretched infinitely around the temple ruins. As sleep began to claim her, she could not help but glance at Rurik. There was a strange ache in his posture, a tension that spoke of pain buried deep beneath layers of strength and legend. And in that moment, she understood something she had not dared to admit. She was not afraid of him entirely. Fear had its place, but curiosity, dangerous, consuming curiosity, crept in. She drifted into a restless sleep, dreams haunted by shadows of the past and whispers of the future. In her dreams, a voice called out, soft and insistent, "The child will decide your fate." Alara awoke with a start, her heart racing. The fire had dwindled to embers, and Rurik was gone. She scanned the ruins in panic, the cold pressing against her like a living thing. A shadow moved along the edge of the clearing, and then he stepped into the dim light of the moon. "I never sleep where danger may strike," he said simply, his eyes softening as they met hers. "Neither should you." Alara felt a shiver, not entirely from the cold. There was something undeniable in the way he watched her, as if he were measuring the strength of her spirit, the courage of her heart. She was a widow, a wanderer, but in his gaze she glimpsed something else, an acknowledgement that she was, perhaps, more than she believed herself to be. The night stretched on, and the wind whispered through the broken walls of the temple. Alara lay close to the fire, Rurik standing as a silent sentinel, and she felt the first stirrings of a strange hope. Perhaps survival was not the only thing she could hope for. Perhaps in the shadow of this giant warrior, she might discover something she had thought lost forever: safety, trust, maybe even the faintest whisper of belonging. And yet, as the first rays of dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose, a chill ran down her spine. The world beyond the clearing was vast and dark, full of mysteries and dangers she could not yet name. Rurik looked toward the horizon, his expression unreadable. "The journey has only begun," he said quietly, "and soon you will learn that even giants are bound by chains they cannot see." Alara's breath caught. She did not understand what he meant, but she knew deep in her bones, that nothing would ever be the same. The wind swept across the frozen ruins, carrying with it a whisper from the mountains, a warning that the child she carried might change everything, not just for her, but for the giant who had claimed her for a single coin. And in that moment, as the sun rose behind the jagged peaks, Alara realized that her life, fragile and uncertain, was now entwined with a destiny far greater than she could imagine. The morning light seeped into the ruins, painting the snow in pale shades of gold. Alara shivered, rubbing her arms as she rose from the cold ground. She had slept fitfully, her dreams tangled with shadows of the past and whispers of the future. Rurik had already mounted his black steed, his silhouette sharp against the rising sun. He had waited for her silently, as if he knew she would awaken with hesitation. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice calm, though it carried a weight that made her chest tighten. Alara swallowed. Her throat felt dry. I will try," she said. She did not fully understand what she was trying for: survival, trust, or something deeper that had begun to stir inside her heart. But she followed him onto the path. The journey through the frozen wilderness was treacherous. Snow drifted like clouds across the ground, hiding jagged rocks and frozen streams. Each step was uncertain, each breath sharp with cold. Yet in the silence between them, Alara felt something she had not in months: safety, fragile but undeniable. Rurik rode beside her with a careful attention, his giant frame moving with ease over the snowy terrain. "Why did you take me?" she asked after hours of quiet, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Rurik's gaze did not falter from the path ahead. "Because the world is cruel," he said, his tone steady. "And yet even cruel worlds need balance. You are more than you seem, and perhaps I am too. We may need each other, though neither of us wants to admit it yet." Alara frowned. "I do not need anyone," she said, though the words felt hollow in her own ears. She had survived this long on her own. Why should she rely on a man, even one as strong and mysterious as Rurik? He glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Do not mistake solitude for strength. Sometimes it is simply exhaustion." The forest began to thicken as they moved deeper into the mountains. The trees grew taller, twisted by centuries of wind and snow, their branches creaking as if they whispered secrets to each other. Shadows shifted unnaturally between the trunks, and Alara's hand instinctively rested on the small dagger she carried at her belt, a precaution against animals, or worse. Rurik noticed her tension but said nothing. He simply guided her through the path, sometimes dismounting to move obstacles or test the ground ahead. The silence between them became a rhythm, a wordless understanding. By midday, they reached a small clearing where a stream ran beneath a thin sheet of ice. The water bubbled faintly, whispering secrets as it flowed. Rurik dismounted, helping Alara steady herself on the slippery ground. She met his eyes briefly, noticing the way the sunlight caught the gold in his hair and the shadows in his green eyes. "You are cautious," he observed, "and wise. That is rare." Alara's cheeks warmed at the faint praise. "I have to be," she said. "The world is not kind to the weak." Rurik nodded, as if acknowledging some unspoken truth. He gestured to the edge of the forest. "We will camp here tonight. The forest is dangerous after dark. Spirits, creatures, they linger near the river. We must be ready." Alara's stomach tightened. "Spirits?" she asked. "Shadows of the past," Rurik replied, his voice low. "Things that linger when death or magic leaves its mark. Some are harmless, others not." As night fell, they built a small fire, its warmth a fragile shield against the icy wind. Rurik moved with efficiency and care, his hands strong and sure, yet there was a gentleness in his movements, especially when he handed her a small portion of food. Alara accepted it silently, her heart twisting at the contrast between the fearsome tales she had heard of him and the man sitting before her. He was a giant in every sense, yet he treated her with a consideration that made her pulse quicken. After they ate, they sat near the fire in a tense but quiet companionship. Alara tried not to watch him too closely, yet she could not help but notice the way his shoulders tensed, the way his jaw clenched, as if he carried burdens heavier than the snow-laden mountains around them. "Why do you wander alone?" Rurik asked eventually, breaking the silence. Alara hesitated. Her story was a heavy one filled with grief and shame, yet something in his tone, a curiosity without judgment, encouraged her to speak. "I lost my home," she began softly. "My husband, he died, and now I carry a child. The village turned against me. I have nothing left but the snow beneath my feet." Rurik listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he said, "Loss is a cruel teacher. It leaves marks we carry forever, but sometimes it also shapes us into who we need to be." Alara looked at him, surprised at the insight in his words. "And what do you carry?" she asked cautiously. He hesitated, as if weighing whether to reveal a secret buried deep within. "I carry a curse," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "One that has left me isolated, feared, and lonely. I have strength, yes, but strength cannot fill the emptiness in a heart." Alara felt a strange kinship with him, a bond forged by loss and solitude. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we are not so different, you and I." Rurik's eyes met hers, and for a moment the cold between them seemed to soften. Yet the shadows in his gaze reminded her that darkness clung to him as tightly as it did to her own past. The night deepened, and the forest seemed to close in around them. The wind moaned through the trees, carrying with it whispers that made Alara's skin prickle. She could not tell whether the sounds were real or the imagination of a mind grown too accustomed to fear. Suddenly, a movement near the edge of the clearing made her gasp. Shadows twisted unnaturally, and shapes emerged from the darkness, thin, gaunt figures that seemed more shadow than flesh. Rurik rose instantly, his presence commanding even the wild night. "Stay behind me," he said, his deep voice steady. His hands moved with precision, drawing a sword that glimmered faintly in the firelight. The creatures advanced, whispering in voices like dry leaves. Alara's heart raced, her instinct screaming to run, yet she held her ground, trusting in the strength of the giant beside her. Rurik moved with grace and ferocity, his sword striking true, each motion precise and controlled. The shadows recoiled, then dissolved into mist under the force of his blows. Alara watched, awe and fear intertwining, as the man who had once seemed untouchable now seemed almost otherworldly, a protector bound by more than simple duty. When the last shadow vanished, Rurik sheathed his sword and turned to her. "You must learn to trust," he said, his tone softer now. "The world is darker than you know. Alone you would not survive a night like this." Alara swallowed, nodding. I trust you," she whispered, though the words felt heavy on her tongue. It was not full trust, not yet. But it was a start. The fire crackled between them, a fragile barrier against the dark forest. Alara felt a strange warmth, not just from the flames, but from the realization that she was not entirely alone. The giant warrior, feared by many, had become her companion, her protector, and perhaps something more. Hours passed in quiet vigilance. The moon rose high, silvering the snow and casting long, eerie shadows. Alara's thoughts wandered to the child she carried, to the life that might come from this perilous journey. Could this strange man, this Rurik, be more than a guardian? Could he be the first person to see her not as a widow, not as a wanderer, but as a whole person again? The wind shifted, carrying a faint whisper that made her shiver. It was as if the forest itself spoke, warning her of trials yet to come. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, a low growl rumbled, different from the creatures they had fought. It was closer, darker, more alive. Rurik stiffened immediately, his eyes narrowing. "They are coming," he said, his voice hardening. "Prepare yourself." Alara's stomach knotted with fear, but she did not step back. She had survived this far, and now she would stand. Beside the giant warrior who had claimed her for a single coin, she felt a courage she had not known she possessed. The shadows moved closer, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. In that tense, frozen moment, Alara realized the truth. Survival was no longer enough. She must fight not just for herself, but for the man who had shown her that even in a world of darkness, there could be sparks of light and perhaps of something far greater. Rurik's hand hovered near his sword, his gaze sharp, unyielding. "This is only the beginning," he said. His eyes met hers, and in that fleeting moment she saw not only the warrior, but the man, a soul bound by solitude, longing, and a hope he dared not speak. And as the first of the new shadows emerged from the darkness, Alara's heart pounded with fear, anticipation, and a strange, budding determination. The journey had grown more perilous, yes, but it had also become something else, a trial of trust, courage, and the fragile stirrings of connection that neither of them could ignore. The night stretched on, and the wind whispered through the ancient trees. The fire burned low, but the bond between them, fragile yet unspoken, had begun to take root. The forest grew darker as Alara and Rurik pressed deeper into the mountains. Snow lay thick over the ground, soft and blinding in the daylight, but in the shadows of the ancient trees, it was as black as night. Each step felt heavy, and the silence around them was almost alive, broken only by the whisper of wind and the crunch of their boots on the frozen earth. Alara's hands ached from gripping her cloak, and her stomach reminded her that their rations were almost gone. Yet she kept her steps steady, her gaze cautious. The shadows they had encountered the night before were gone, but she knew better than to believe the forest was safe. Rurik rode beside her, his massive frame unshaken by the rough terrain. Every so often he would glance at her, as if measuring her strength, her courage, and perhaps something deeper. Alara felt the weight of his eyes on her and found herself both frightened and strangely comforted. "You are stronger than you realize," Rurik said finally, his voice cutting through the still air. "And yet you still fear what is unknown. That is human." Alara looked down, her cheeks burning. "I do not fear," she said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. "I only watch carefully." He chuckled softly, a sound that was rare and unexpected from someone so large and imposing. "Careful, yes, fear, I see it. And it does not shame you, it is a guide. It keeps you alive." For a long moment they traveled in silence. The forest seemed endless, stretching in every direction like a living labyrinth. And then in the distance they saw it, a faint glow flickering between the trees. Alara's heart skipped. "What is that?" she whispered. Rurik's eyes narrowed. "A fire." "Not ours." He dismounted, landing with a thud that made the snow tremble. "It could be travelers or trouble. Stay close." The closer they got, the more distinct the glow became. Shadows danced around the source, moving unnaturally. Rurik held out a hand to her. "Be ready," he said. "Do not step forward until I say." Alara nodded, her pulse racing. They moved cautiously, each step measured. The fire revealed more shapes, figures cloaked in black, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They whispered among themselves in a language that was harsh and unfamiliar. Rurik's hand moved to his sword. "These are not ordinary travelers," he said quietly. "They are scouts for something older, darker." Alara swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to run, to hide behind him, but she stayed. Something in his steady presence gave her courage, even as fear clawed at her chest. The cloaked figures noticed them and began to circle, their movements silent and predatory. Rurik stepped in front of Alara, his sword drawn, his stance unyielding. The forest seemed to hold its breath. "You should not be here," he called, his voice echoing across the clearing. "Leave or face consequences you do not understand." The figures did not move faster, but their whispers grew louder, like dry leaves scraping across stone. Rurik's eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural light that made the shadows shiver. Alara felt a sudden surge of fear, but also something else, determination. She could not let this man face danger alone. She stepped forward, clutching the small dagger at her belt. "Stay behind me," Rurik warned, but there was no anger in his voice, only a deep concern that made her heart ache. As the figures closed in, the ground beneath them trembled. Ice cracked and splintered, sending a shiver through the clearing. The shadows seemed to pull themselves toward Rurik, testing the limits of his strength. Then, with a roar that shook the trees, Rurik moved. His sword cut through the air with precision, striking the nearest shadow. The others recoiled, but their numbers were many. Alara watched in awe as he fought, not recklessly but with careful control, each motion deliberate, as if the dance of battle were etched into his very soul. And then, a shadow lunged at Alara. She stumbled back, her dagger raised in a trembling hand. The figure's hood fell, revealing a pale, emotionless face. Before she could react, Rurik was there, sweeping her aside with one hand and striking the shadow down with the other. "You must stay behind me," he said, his voice sharp. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw fear, anger, and something she could not name. The shadows retreated into the forest, dissolving like mist under the morning sun. Alara's chest heaved, her hands shaking from both fear and adrenaline. Rurik lowered his sword slowly. "You are unharmed," he said, though his voice was not entirely calm. "But you must understand, this forest is alive with power. Not all of it is good, and you more than most are at risk." Alara nodded, unable to speak. She realized something then. She had begun to care for this man, not just as a protector, but as someone who might see the strength in her when the world had not. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. They moved toward a small cave that Rurik knew would shelter them for the night. Inside, the warmth was a relief against the biting cold outside. He built a fire, and Alara sat near it, watching the flames dance. "You fought well," she said quietly, unable to keep the admiration out of her voice. Rurik did not respond immediately. He stared into the fire, his expression distant. "I fight because I must," he said finally. "Not because I wish to. Strength is a burden as much as a gift. And the more I protect, the more I fear for what I cannot control." Alara considered his words. "We cannot control everything," she said softly, "but we can try together." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw a flicker of something, trust perhaps, or longing, buried beneath layers of caution. "Perhaps," he said, his voice low. "Perhaps together we can endure more than we could alone." For the first time since she had met him, Alara felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the fragile, budding connection between them, built not on words alone, but on shared survival, on quiet understanding, on the recognition of loneliness mirrored in each other's eyes. Night fell, and the wind whispered outside the cave. Alara lay on a bed of furs, her body tired but her mind racing. She thought of her child, growing inside her, and of the strange, towering man who had become both her protector and her companion. She wondered if he, too, carried fears for the future, for the life that had yet to be born. Rurik remained near the fire, restless, his sword within reach. He did not sleep, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the cave mouth. Alara watched him, her curiosity mixing with something deeper, something like trust, tempered by the understanding that he had lived a lifetime in solitude and loss. Hours passed, and the wind outside grew fiercer. A howl echoed from the mountains, chilling her blood. Rurik's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, and she realized that the forest had not finished testing them. Suddenly, a tremor ran through the cave floor. Stones shifted, and a deep, low growl vibrated through the walls. Alara froze, clutching her cloak. "They are close," Rurik said, his voice barely a whisper. He stood, moving to stand between her and the cave entrance. His eyes shone with a faint light, the remnants of the power that had allowed him to repel the shadows before. Alara felt her heart pound. She wanted to flee, to hide, yet she did not. Not anymore. She had begun to trust him, and with that trust came courage she did not know she possessed. The cave entrance darkened as a massive shadow approached. It was larger than anything she had seen. its shape shifting and flickering like smoke in the wind. Rurik's sword gleamed as he faced it, and Alara realized that she could do nothing but stand with him, ready to face the unknown together. "Whatever comes," Rurik said, his voice low but steady, "we face it as one." Alara nodded, her hand brushing against the hilt of her dagger. Though she was small and untrained, she felt a strange determination settle over her. They would survive, together. The shadow moved closer and the cave trembled. Alara's pulse raced, a mix of fear and anticipation, and she realized that the bond between them, fragile, unspoken, and growing, was the only thing that made the darkness bearable. And as the shadow stepped into the firelight, its form twisting and unnatural, she understood the truth. The forest, the giants, the curses, they were all part of a larger destiny, and she and Rurik were bound to face it together, whatever the cost. The night stretched on, the shadow looming, and Alara's heart held one simple, desperate thought. I will not let him face this alone. The shadow in the cave moved like liquid, shifting with a life of its own. Rurik's sword cut through the air, each strike precise and powerful, but the darkness was relentless. Alara pressed herself close to the fire, her hands gripping her dagger, her heart pounding in time with the roar of the wind outside. "This is it," Rurik said, his voice low but firm. "No more running, we face this together." Alara nodded, a strange courage rising within her. She had followed him into danger before, but now it felt different. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a partner, bound by trust and the knowledge that what lay ahead could change everything, for both of them. The shadow surged forward, taking a form that was at once terrifying and sorrowful. It resembled a giant, but its body was made of smoke and broken ice. Its eyes glowed with a cold light, and its voice, when it spoke, was like the echo of 1,000 storms. "Rurik," it said, "you cannot escape your past. You will remain alone forever." Rurik's jaw tightened, his grip on his sword firm. "I am not alone," he said, his voice steady. His gaze shifted to Alara, who stood trembling but unyielding. "Not while she stands with me." The shadow roared, striking with a force that made the cave tremble. Rurik met it blow for blow, the sound of steel against shadow echoing through the chamber. Alara's mind raced. She could not fight like him, but she realized that the key to survival might not be strength alone. She needed to act with courage and cleverness. The shadow lunged at her, its icy form stretching like mist. Alara dodged and, remembering a small trick she had learned from watching Rurik, she threw a piece of burning wood into its form. The shadow hissed and recoiled, giving Rurik the opening he needed to strike. "You are stronger than you know," Rurik said between blows, his voice steady despite the chaos. "And you are braver than I imagined." Alara's chest heaved. I only do not wish to fail," she shouted, her voice trembling. "Not for myself, but for you." The shadow shrieked, a sound that seemed to pierce the very air. It swirled faster, its form condensing, pulling the darkness into a single, towering figure. Rurik's eyes narrowed. "This is the heart of it," he said. "It feeds on fear. It will not stop until one of us gives in." Alara took a deep breath, feeling the child within her move. It was a strange, comforting reminder of life and hope amidst the terror. She stepped forward, her hands open. "I will not give in," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "And you cannot harm me while I stand with him." The shadow hesitated, its form flickering. Rurik saw the moment, the hesitation that gave him the chance to strike with everything he had. Steel met darkness in a brilliant flash, and the shadow screamed, splitting into shards that vanished like smoke in the wind. For a long moment, silence returned. The fire crackled weakly, and snow drifted in from the broken cave mouth. Rurik lowered his sword, breathing heavily. He turned to Alara, his face a mixture of relief and awe. You faced it," he said softly. "You did not falter, not even for a moment." Alara's knees wobbled, and she sank to the furs near the fire. I was terrified," she admitted. "But I knew I could not leave you alone." Rurik knelt beside her, his massive hands brushing her hair from her face. And that courage, that is what breaks chains. Yours, mine, all of them. For the first time, Rurik spoke openly of the curse that had haunted him for so long. The shadow, it was part of me, a fragment of my own fear, my own loneliness. I thought I was bound to it forever. I thought I would never know warmth, trust, or anything else. Alara's heart ached for him. But now, she whispered. Now, he said, his gaze softening as it met hers, I am free because you did not let me face it alone. You believed in me and in us. A strange warmth filled the cave, not from the fire alone, but from the bond between them, forged in shared danger and mutual trust. The frost of their solitude began to thaw, and Alara realized that the mountains, the forest, and even the shadows could not break what had grown between them. The wind outside carried a gentler whisper now, as if the forest itself recognized the change. Rurik took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. We have survived the first trial, he said, but the journey is not over. There will be more dangers, more shadows. Yet I do not fear them, not while you are with me. Alara squeezed his hand, feeling a strange peace settle over her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope, not just for survival, but for life, for love, and for a future she had thought impossible. Days passed, and the mountains grew less hostile as they moved toward a hidden valley where Rurik had once sought refuge. The valley was alive with color and warmth, a secret haven untouched by the cold and darkness beyond. Streams ran clear, and wildflowers poked through the snow, signs of life that made Alara's heart swell. This place, she whispered, taking in the beauty. It feels alive. Rurik nodded. It is. And it is safe here, at least for now. We can rest, heal, and prepare for whatever comes next. As they settled near a warm spring, Alara felt the first stirrings of the child she carried more keenly. She placed a hand on her belly and Rurik watched her, awe and reverence in his eyes. You are a mother, he said softly, and you are brave beyond measure. I am honored to stand beside you. Alara looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his golden gaze. For a moment, words were unnecessary. The bond between them, tested by shadows and danger, had grown into something stronger, an unspoken promise, a connection that could not be broken by fear or darkness. Rurik, she whispered, we have survived so much. Perhaps we can face anything together. He smiled then, a rare, genuine smile that lit his face with warmth. Together, he echoed, his voice steady. No matter what comes. The days in the valley were filled with quiet moments of healing. Rurik hunted and gathered, and Alara tended to the small injuries they had sustained. She learned to trust her instincts, to move with caution and confidence. And in the quiet hours when the snow melted into streams and the sun warmed the frozen earth, they spoke, not of fear or danger, but of dreams, memories, and the faint hope of a life beyond the mountains. One morning, as the sun rose over the peaks, Rurik led Alara to a hidden grove where ancient stones marked the place of old magic. The air shimmered with energy, and Alara felt the presence of something greater than either of them. This is the place, Rurik said. Here I can break the last part of the curse, but it requires both of us trust, courage, and the willingness to face the past together. Alara nodded, her hand on her belly. I am ready, she said. If it frees you and protects our child, I will face it. The ritual was not simple. Shadows of the past rose to challenge them, forcing Rurik to confront his deepest fears. Alara stood beside him, holding his hand, her presence a steady light in the darkness. Together they chanted words older than memory, drawing strength from each other. The shadows shrieked and twisted, but neither of them faltered. And then, with a final surge of energy, the darkness shattered, dissipating into the air like morning mist. Rurik collapsed to his knees, exhausted but free. He looked at Alara, tears glistening in his eyes. It is done, he whispered. The curse is broken because of you. Alara fell to her knees beside him, placing her hand on his chest. We did it together. The forest around them seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Sunlight streamed through the trees, warming the earth and the snow. Life, fragile and beautiful, returned to the valley. Weeks later, Ilara's child was born under the golden light of dawn, a symbol of hope, love, and new beginnings. Rurik held them both, his massive hands gentle and protective. The fear, the loneliness, and the shadows of the past were gone. In their place stood trust, courage, and a bond forged in the fire of danger and the quiet moments of shared life. Ilara looked at Rurik, her heart full. "We survived," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, his gaze steady, "and we will face whatever comes next together." The mountains stretched beyond the valley, vast and untamed, but they no longer seemed threatening. Together they had faced darkness and emerged stronger. Together they had found trust, courage, and love. And as the sun rose higher, melting the last of the snow, Ilara realized the truth she had longed to hear. Some bonds, forged in fire and shadow, could never be broken. The giant warrior and the widow, bound by fate and courage, stood side by side. The future was theirs to shape, and for the first time it felt bright, endless, and full of promise.